Good morning or afternoon or evening, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from. Thanks for tuning in. This is a follow-up conversation to the webinar that we ran at Portable called Designing with ChatGPT, all about human-centered design and large language models like ChatGPT. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the countries that we're all meeting from this morning. So for me, that's the Larrakia country up here in Darwin in the Northern Territory. Adam?
Joining from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation today, Joe.
Thanks, Adam. Aisling?
I'm usually down in Boonwurrung country, but today I'm joining from Wurundjeri country.
Thanks, Aisling. And Sarah?
I'm also joining from Wurundjeri country today.
Thanks, Sarah. We acknowledge that the lands that we're meeting on have been cared for tens of thousands of years by Aboriginal people. And we acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks everyone for joining me. I won't do a full round of intros because if you've watched the original webinar, you'll know who I'm speaking to, these wonderful people who we have the pleasure of chatting with today. Today is going to be all about following up on some of the questions that came up in our first webinar. There were lots of great questions that people submitted through the chat. We didn't get a chance to really get to any of them. I think we got to one at the end. So today we've picked out some of the questions that we feel worthy of some discussion for us, or that we have something to share on. We're not going to get to everyone's question, unfortunately, but we've tried to get to the ones that we felt we have some that are giving us a bit of fuel for discussion. It's going to be a pretty casual chat off the cuff. And just to repeat some of the framing and context I shared in the first webinar, our intention here is to demonstrate a healthy dialogue about the potentials and pitfalls of this powerful technology to inspire others with questions and considerations so that they can confidently move forward in their own discussions and explorations in their own work. And so in order to explore this freely and openly, we're still going to let go of being experts who have all the answers. And we're going to be experimental, be open with this conversation. And our main hope is through a public demonstration of a conversation like this is that you're inspired to take similar questions into your own workplaces and host discussions that drive smarter, safer use of this technology. Anything anyone wanted to add to that context or intention before we dive right into some questions? Nope. Okay.
Nailed it, Joe.
Okay. In no particular order, I'm going to jump in. We've got three questions here that we've kind of grouped together. So I'll read all three and then we'll just open it up for thoughts and feelings from everyone here. The first is from Claire McKinley. The question is, can we guarantee confidentiality or the safety of proprietary information if we're using ChatGPT at work, and in particular for research? There's another one from Simon Jankelson here. What are the confidentiality concerns when inputting UX data? And a combined question from Eugene Hawkins and an anonymous contributor. Given user-centered design is based a lot around feedback loops, how soon before most of the process is able to be automated with large language models or GPT tech? Where do you see it fitting in best in the double diamond loop? So we've got some questions here around safety and proprietary information being inputted into it. And a connected question there about where in the process we see this tool being used in terms of design process. What's coming up for people? Adam.
I had a thought, Joe, based on, I guess, one of the principles that we shared in the first webinar that was underlying a lot of what we were talking about, which was to safely experiment on oneself. So I'd go as far as cautioning at this point that we don't use these tools to input actual data that we have received from participants through activities or observations or other forms, because we, for starters, don't know what's going to be used from the data that is collected by these tools, even if they're not training on it directly at the moment. Secondly, we would need to have asked for consent for that to occur with the people we work with. And I think thirdly, it removes the human from the synthesis process. And instead, my recommendation to folks at this stage would probably be to use it as a thinking partner to help you hone what you're trying to say as a result, what you're trying to do to be a custodian of those stories and elevate the voices that you've heard from rather than replacing them. So that would be to answer sort of the questions around confidentiality, safety, the risks of inputting user data. I haven't fully addressed whereabouts in the design model it fits or how the feedback for user-centered design loops might be replaced, but that'd be my cautions around user data for sure.
Thanks, Adam. Any comments or questions or dissenting views?
I do have a question for you, Adam. When you're saying user data, what do you mean? Are you talking about personal information, de-identified observations? Can you give us a sense of what do you mean when you say user data in this context?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I'm probably talking about all the forms, but the different forms probably need different levels of care as well in terms of the experiments you might do. So certainly it's good principle to anonymize your data anyway, where you can, especially when you're trying to represent synthesis and insights on behalf of groups of people. That's always a good thing to try and do anyway, especially if you've promised and committed to that in how you've sought consent. There might be anonymized forms of capturing data anyway. There might be things like surveys where people can opt out of disclosing personal information. But even then, I think we have to ask what we would be putting it into the tool to do. And if the answer is to replace the human forms of synthesis, then I don't know that I see as much potential as the human designer who has an embodied form of absorbing learning as much as textual forms of absorbing learning doing the synthesis. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Ashley. I would say it's, anything that's text related that you've extracted from any activities with a real person. Those would be the things I'd be avoiding putting straight into the tool.
Thanks, Adam. I'll go to Sarah next.
Just to take an opposite view for a moment, I wonder, and we don't know what OpenAI is going to do with all of the data that they're collecting, but I wonder if there's some kind of opportunity for a massive scale social hacktivism thing where we're really deliberate about being like, we think that this type of person is really underrepresented. I am for sure going to feed this tool lots and lots of information about this so that it can be a little bit less or more inclusive in the future. But that's a very speculative way, and we have no way of knowing what will happen. But I think the idea of, setting up eventually just separate instances of a large language model like ChatGPT and actually being able to be confident that the data is secure and using that in a kind of design workflow, I think that's got lots of potential. And I'd really love to explore that because I know, Adam, you've got lots of thoughts about that too.
Yeah, Sarah, like mind-blowing speculation there around large-scale movements to influence the data. train AI. That's just like, yeah, that's mind-boggling. I'm curious, Adam, if there's an assumption baked into what you're saying. So, given, let's say, consent was sorted, and let's say we had confidence about how data is being used in terms of when we're uploading data. The privacy of that is being maintained. Given those were no longer questions, which I understand they currently are, the point around using it as a tool for synthesis, I'm wondering if there's an assumption baked into what you're saying, which is that the humans using it would hand over the sense-making power entirely to the technology, as opposed to using it as a tool to help with their own process of embodied sense-making.
Yeah, and then that I guess lends itself to the question around which point of the process is it best used as well, Joe. So I think the caution I'd have about it being part of early analysis and sense making with data is that human-centered designers, when they're sort of at their worst, will be reductive and abstract too far from the real experiences of a person. I think there's always risk that we can do that as humans. So to then, offer that abstraction another layer further by having a large language model apply that same sort of approach to abstraction. I think I'd caution against that, because the real experience of a human being is so nuanced and so different to even what a persona that we might produce says it could be. So then, yeah, back to the which part of the process. I think, again, as that thinking partner, when you're beginning to articulate, I actually think it's a really great way to avoid blank canvas syndrome, to help you be sharper on your points, and to work like a critique buddy on what you're trying to put out there in the world. Because one of the things we find as designers is it's so hard to pull yourself out of the detail and into the punchiest things you want to say. I think it's a really great tool for that.
Yeah, thanks for the response, Adam. I'm thinking not only the articulation as a thought partner, like in terms of how we're going to communicate insights, but potentially also as a thought partner for lines of inquiry we might have as well, like at the beginning of the process, like before we've conducted research, when we're in the middle of it, of like, to help us kind of bounce off something to better formulate the questions and the lines of inquiry we have. Aisling, I see a hand there.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, Adam and Sarah, I think I'm holding a little assumption that I wanted to make clear, because I know that this is something that we talk about, and that's the different approaches to our sense making: deductive, reductive, abstractive, abduction. And when you were describing, Adam, at what point in the process you might invite in ChatGPT to bounce that proverbial ball against the wall, to support you as you're trying to make sense of what you're doing. I think being really clear about what type of critical thinking you're applying, what type of rationalization you're applying, can help you figure out, how am I inviting ChatGPT in? I am looking to crunch the stats in the qualitative responses to this survey data, but that's not going to be the end of my insights, because I'm in the background working on the abductive process of looking at the qualitative data in that survey and the research interviews and all the engagements to figure out, so what does this mean, and then combine the two together. So I've partnered with ChatGPT in a deliberative way to do some number crunching, because I'm not super au fait with spreadsheeting, but it's complementing my process. It's one thing that comes to mind, and I just wanted to mention. And now all the hands are up, and this is good. I don't know who was up first.
Thanks, Aisling. Adam was first, and then we'll go to Sarah.
Oh, it's just a recommendation for those curious ears listening in. If you want to know more about the inductive, deductive, abductive modes of synthesis, read John Kolko's article about synthesis and sense making. Quick Google should help you find it. We'll share a link hopefully alongside this video.
Yeah, it is an excellent article.
Oh, I like one bit I remember, I think it's from that article, one bit that always stuck with me was sometimes part of the designer's process is sticking up a bunch of like post-it notes on the wall and like clustering and doing all the synthesis thing, and then never looking at it again. I know that rang true with me, some of my experience. Sarah.
Okay, so I think you three in this room know, but something that broadly people may not know is that I really enjoy thinking about how we can empathize with data objects. And what I wanted to share now is how I think really like truly integrating something like Chatty in a design workflow could be if we were really like empathetic to it. So I think I really think that designers are going to come up with a way to use a ChatGPT in a workflow that fits our particular practice and you know, their values. But I also think that eventually other large language models are going to become accessible enough and affordable enough for us to train or tune using our own organization's data. And then that becomes a really powerful idea for querying our own database of like user research data, for example. And I have a hypothesis that to really benefit from such a workflow and a hybrid collaboration between like AI and human design intelligence, as design researchers, we will need to start putting heaps more importance on how we collect data, curate data, and record it. And so what we might be able to do is say, if we're taking a particular route of analysis, we're saying our job becomes being great custodians, and we're leaving space deliberately for an AI to help with the thing that we think it's good at. Maybe it's clustering, maybe it's identifying themes. And then we focus again on like the critical evaluation, the creation of insight and action from that data. And I was thinking, you know, sometimes we think about designers as being generative and creative and kind of artists, but maybe we are something more like museum curators and restorers and shepherds for the data, so that we can facilitate you know, a creative process with intelligence that is not human. How far can we extend our creative empathy to an AI that we're going to bring onto our team? I reckon that's like kind of a different way to think about it.
Adam, I'm actually going to bring in another question here that that feels connected, and then feel free to continue on your line of thought, Adam and Ashley. This is from Eugene Hawkins. AI, without overly limiting guardrails, could come up with some crazy, interesting approaches / ways of thinking about design that our own logic wouldn't necessarily be able to come up with. It could really push the discipline or paradigm forward. It seems to be what you're pointing to a little there, Sarah. Adam, any thoughts or what's coming up for you?
Yeah, it's a useful segue to the point I was going to make anyway, Joe. I'll add something to that question, to my response that I didn't originally have. So I think there's an emerging responsibility here to understand what sort of designer you are in the world, including what sort of designer ChatGPT could be. But to answer that question, but what I mean by that is, and it's a lifetime's work. I'm actively doing it myself at the moment, is to know what sort of way you work as a designer, what you value. You know, we know great people in the world like Melissa Nova doing a design character course for folks to help them understand what that looks like for them. How you process information. There are cognitive forms of being a designer. There are embodied forms of being a designer. There are pragmatic designers. There are, you know, practice-driven designers. Knowing what that is can help you know how to use these tools without being scattergun about them and where they're going to augment what you do. The reason why I'm so resistant to using it as a data analysis and synthesis tool is because I relate more to an embodied form of learning in design. And as designers are getting charged with more and more complexity in the world, we're getting zoomed out to further and further systems views in the work we're doing. Emergent practice becomes part of the puzzle where you don't have a plan and you're not supposed to, and you go in and you try and sense your way through it. Knowing who you are as a designer is an imperative that we should all be trying to work to anyway, especially with the emergence of these tools. So I just thought that was an important thing to add.
We have the technology to thank for that.
Maybe.
Driving us in that direction. Ashley, you had your hand up.
I'm just reveling for a moment in that beautiful turn of phrase, Sarah, like curatorial shepherds and guides, but also your viewpoint, Adam, which I also agree and share, that what motivates us as designers to do the work. If you're taking a values-driven approach, what is your own embodiment? You know, if I use the example, as humans, we're all a collection of stories. We might prioritize one of those stories as our sense of identity in any given moment, but all those other stories still coexist in how we experience reality, and then how we bring that into our work to help us sense make. And then it becomes part of that self-awareness, bias, awareness, blind spot awareness, and that learning journey that we're all on as values-driven designers. There is questions, you know, from the chat, and one is from, I think, Simon Jenkels. What are the confidentiality concerns when inputting UX data? And something that comes to mind that feels really connected. And I think I'm asking this question because I'm interested, and I share that interest with you, Adam, of value-driven design. And I think it relates to what you're describing, Sarah, around being a curatorial shepherd. And it's, how do we know when it's good? How do we know what's right? How do we place that value on it? And I can't help but think about like broader regulations, like the new AI Act in the EU, GDPR, Californian AI law and bot law. And I think about Australian context and the regulatory bodies that exist here around AI and around data security, cybersecurity, and all those interconnected things that for a lot of people are the same thing. And I think about us as designers often getting into spaces and places where we might need to have that awareness to help us inform what does good look like? What does a ethical practice look like? What are some confidentiality concerns? And it actually feels like part of what makes us designers is to step outside of that space and ask those dark questions and I almost think about an iceberg model, try and figure out what are we implying in this work? What are we not implying in this work? What are the intended, unintended consequences? But I think all of that comes from what you've described, Adam, your embodiment and sense of self-awareness, and also from your positioning, Sarah. So to Simon Jenkels, I say, I don't know what the confidentiality concerns are when inputting UX data to the platform. But what Adam has described and what Sarah has described are the things that I lean into to try and figure out those things in the context of whatever project or research we're looking at, and whatever impact that might have on the systems around what it is that we're working on. Yeah, Adam.
I'm really glad that you've raised some of those points, Aisling, and it's actually offered another avenue alongside just data as a concern when it comes to ethics that I'm thinking of around this body of questions we've started with, which is where does co-design fit into this world?
Because I had the same question.
Yeah, like if we think about, and everyone may have different definitions for co-design, and it's a worthy topic of its own, but when I think of co-design, I think of it being power redistribution, and it's a way to dismantle old power structures and elevate voices that need to be heard into decision-making positions safely and with the right support in place. If we go towards utilizing these tools for processing data, for shortening feedback loops, for augmenting our practice, what is lost when it comes to truly participatory forms of design and decision making? And I think that's a question we haven't yet broached in these discussions, but a really important one for us to not necessarily know how to answer just yet, but to be raising as part of this conversation. I think arguably you can insert zero technology into a co-design process and make fundamental shifts, innovative shifts in the world.
Yeah, the thought was coming to me from thinking about the risks of this technology making things like user research and much more accessible for people who aren't designers to be doing, and to use AI tools as a way of generating pictures of who users might be for a particular product or experience. And that got me thinking about how it risks emphasizing the extractive form of design and design research, as opposed to the more power sharing forms of co-design. And yeah, it just got me thinking about, well, yeah, what is the place there? It could also serve the purpose of then emphasizing what's different about that form of co-design, and that becomes more where we focus as designers, because those are the things that, again, the machines can't do as well yet. Yeah.
And arguably, if the tools are used really well, they could be a democratizing force that could bring design capability to people in relational approaches with designers.
Mm-hmm. Aisling.
I have a question, and it's as you've been talking, Joe and Adam, I'm thinking about what's Chatty's role in the co-design engagement. If Chatty is a cobot, like a co-working robot, what role does Chatty have in different co-design engagements?
It'd be interesting, yeah, having it as a co-design participant in the room. That gives me cause for concern, but just thinking.
Yep. I think it's a good spicy question, though. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just thinking, I wonder if it has a role to play in making co-design more accessible for people, in the same way that I find it helpful to maybe help refine my ideas, which sometimes just garbly nonsense, and it can help it present it in a more clear fashion. I wonder if people can use it as their own accessibility platform to get more into co-design, and whether as design facilitators, that's something that we could almost build into, like, hey, would you like to have this tool, that tool, chatty, how would you like to use it? That could be fun.
Adam?
Yeah, and I was going to come back to that part of the process to build on what Sarah's saying, with it being used as an actual active tool within the work. Your reminder, Joe, earlier about it being used in the planning stages. I think this also underscores the imperative of these tool producers to be properly embracing of diversity and equity in who is able to input the data in and whose views are represented. Because if that is done, then, you know, I'm not everyone. I am the designer I am, with my own identity and experiences. So when it comes to me trying to plan to engage with, say, a live example at the moment, year 3 and 4 students, I was one once. I'm not one in 2023, and not in the places I'm visiting in this project. Could something like a ChatGPT help me reframe my language and my activities and the things I'm planning to do for better for the audiences that I'm trying to work with, who are not like me? And I think that's another thing that these tools should aspire to be doing. They're not quite there yet. They're helpful.
I'm going to shift us into another question here. This one from Adriano Di Prato, and there's also another question that's linked from Anonymous. The reality is, actually, this isn't really a question, but there is a follow-up question here. The reality is that AI tools like ChatGPT will change the relative value of the human skills that Adam mentioned in our webinar, such as creativity, problem solving, adaptability, ethical awareness, emotional self-regulation, teamwork, and critical thinking. So the value of these human skills, that ChatGPT will change the relative value of them. And therefore, in the context of learning environments like schools and universities, what students should know and be able to do, right? So there's a kind of pointing, a reflection here around that. What are the skills? What do we emphasize? How does this technology shift what we're teaching and what we're emphasizing in education? And there's a follow-up question here from Anonymous around how we see ChatGPT affecting the workforce, especially entry-level jobs. So I'm curious what people's thoughts are on this. How might this technology shift what we emphasize in terms of education and the skills that we're expecting people to come in with, or needing people to come in with to the workforce? Particularly thinking about design, if you wanted to narrow it down.
I think for starters, Joe, I mean, it actually, just to put something out there, I think doubling down on what's good about learning how to be a designer. We had a conversation before we hit the record button about really imaginative ways to get creative and generative with these tools. And so having that mindset, training in that mindset, it's actually about being more creative, more experimental, more curious, I think, rather than any opposite sort of prioritization of skill sets towards analytical or process driven, or you know, the other sort of forms of thinking that can be valuable in the world as well. Yeah,
in some sense, learning to use and practice those parts of our experience, behavior, human nature, so that we can become better masters of these tools, rather than falling in line behind them, but actually, you know, leading and guiding them with the things that we value.
I kind of am reminded of going to art school on the cusp of moving from like printing and developing your own stuff in a wet lab to like everything going digital. And I was thinking you could think about a lot of other design tools like Photoshop, right? And go, how did we teach that? How do we teach people to be creative with Photoshop, to problem solve in Photoshop, to have an ethical awareness about, I don't know, making everything look blemish free in Photoshop? I actually think that we have encountered these questions before, and like we'll continue to kind of encounter them. And I think it's quite quick. Like Photoshop was only 20 years ago, and now we don't talk about it. We might not even use it. So framing it in the big picture, I actually have a lot of faith in us and the education, and just people themselves being inquiry driven to try and work this out.
Thanks, Sarah. We might bring our chat to a close in a moment. I think I just wanted to ask everyone what questions they're currently wrestling with, and if anyone needs to leave early, they are welcome to, because I know we're in the middle of the workday here. But I wanted to ask if anyone had any questions that they're currently wrestling with that they wanted to kind of just leave us with. And I'm springing this on you without much notice.
I'd love to add something in, just having listened to Adam and Sarah share, and it's around the context of learning journeys, be that informal education in schools, universities, and different formative environments, but also in the workplace. I think as designers, and I say this coming from art and design school as well, learning to play with the new technology, learning to play with a CNC machine, like with safety regulation in place, of course, but learning to play with Photoshop, learning to play with non-digital analog materials, printing press, that kind of thing, is a way to interrogate the use of it. And I think I'm really wearing my designer hat when I talk about design for use, because there are other forms of creativity as well. I think maybe exploring those forms of creativity and thinking about what role does Chatty have in learning to be creative in different ways, in those different analytical methods, in different channels, for different purposes, for different use. And also, I really hope that we don't not teach it in schools, because it's such a wonderful opportunity for students to get to play with it and discover for themselves what is their ethics around this, what are their values around this. They might be fine with photoshopping the blemishes out, but they might want to explore, what does that actually mean, the impact that has on others. So I hope that we don't not teach it in schools, and we encourage critical awareness in students.
And I like that the way we need to teach it now is, you know, without having all the answers, but with that experimental mindset and teaching those values as we go, and doing that safely. Aisling, I know you have to run into another presentation, so you're welcome to move on, and Adam and Sarah and I can close. Thank you, team. I do reluctantly enjoy, and I'll miss our chats. I'll catch up with you later. Black box. Thanks, Josh. Bye. Adam and Sarah, or Sarah, anything you wanted to share? Might go to you first, Adam, and then if there's anything you had that you'd like to leave us with in terms of things you're still wrestling with or what you're carrying forward.
Great, great allocation there, Joe, because I'd love Sarah to have the final word on this one too. I think something I'm left as a question with is partly a statement, but what's our responsibility as designers when it comes to new technologies? And we've always had this responsibility, and we've also been able to be complicit in the ethics agnostic, or at worst, ethically kind of undesirable rollout of technology. So no one needs to know how a website works to interact with a website, because designers build the interface. No one needs to know what the coding language is behind an app, because a designer builds an interface. And broader than that, designers now help build services, and they help build ecosystems. And so we do that through understanding interaction, through understanding affordances, through understanding the desires of people, through understanding where their assumptions might be, what their learning gaps are that need to be filled in, and what needs to be said about the use of a tool, what needs to be disclosed. So I'm left wondering, what can we do as ethically minded designers to bring the right affordances, interactions, experiences with these tools forward so that people have the most informed and safe use of these tools as possible?
Yeah, I love that.
Could I just, sorry, Sarah, because I want to close with you. I think, building on what Ashley said as well, what you said, there is such wild experimentation happening now, and productization happening, and commercialization happening of these tools. It is like a runaway train, and it's the Wild West. And I think if designers want to have the kind of thoughtful and considerate experiences come to light, we need to be acting with the same degree of aggressively productive experimentation around some of these what we're bringing to the table, lest the current trends and currents take us where they will.
That's such a good call to action. Aggressively productive experimentation. I love it. Building on what you were saying, Adam, around designing for a good, safe, ethical use of it. I've been having chats sometimes just with my son, who's 7, and I was trying to tell him one day about what I do at work, and I was thinking about AI, and I was trying to describe it as it's kind of like a robot that lives maybe in your computer. And we were exploring this, and I was like, well, how would you know how to use it safely? And he's like, read the instructions. And I'm like, And then what if it doesn't come with instructions? And he's like, watch it and see what it does, and then do things differently if you see it being stupid. I'm like, good call, buddy. So I'm just kind of going what is just some straight up stuff that we've learned through producing technology, safety instructions that we could make simple enough, or that we should expect producers of AI to make available for us to share exactly what they know and all of the testing that they've had to do, because we can learn by interacting with it, but perhaps there is also a responsibility for them to do some really hard testing and share that with us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Adam, and thanks, Aisling. And thanks all of you for listening and for your great questions. I suspect this won't be the last you hear of us at Portable and this kind of technology. I look forward to more experimentation, more deep discussion, and more sharing with all of you what we're learning as we go. So keep the conversation going. Feel free to get in touch with us through the channels you can find on our website, through our newsletter. As this rapidly evolves, watch this space and contribute and be part of the conversation with us. Great. Thanks, everyone.